Welcome to our first video on the nervous system. This is our unit that we're going to be covering for the rest of this whole third 6 weeks. I'm combining a lot of things, but it all involves the system that controls and coordinates your movements, thoughts, your senses, how you respond to things, your reflexes. So we'll be doing quite a bit of different things within this whole 6 weeks. But we'll start first with looking at how or the types of cells that are involved in all of these processes, and those are called neurons. We looked at these way back a long time ago when we did the tissues, so it may or may not sound familiar to you, but you will recognize it hopefully when you see the first picture in your notes. So this is, let me move myself up here. So this is a picture of a neuron. The title is sideways, but that helps you see how the length of the neuron, and I'll show you a model of this in just a second. But when we're labeling it, there's basically three main parts. You've got this portion here, which is called the cell body. Rid of that there. So the cell body is the large central portion. That's where all of the organelles are found. Remember, the organelles are the small little organs within the cell that do the different jobs for the cell. And you notice this is a nucleus right here. And there's lots of different organelles. It has a large quantity of organelles called the mitochondria. If you recall from biology and what we talked about with the cell review, this is the organelle that is involved in producing energy for the cell. Tell me again, what is the chemical that is produced that your body uses for energy? That's right, it is the ATP is the name of that molecule. So as you would expect, neurons are very involved with lots of things, so they would have a lot of mitochondria in the cell body. The next part of a neuron involves these processes here, the small ones, kind of like trees, and then there's always at least one long, skinny process. Most neurons look like this, where you have a bunch of tiny ones and then one long one. It's called a unipolar neuron. There are some that have more than one of these structures, but we're going to focus on this one because that's the majority of the ones that you have in your body. These smaller tree-like processes are called, dendrites. Dendrites. That root word dendra means tree, and so these kind of look like tree branches, so someone named them that because of that. But these are the processes that receive impulses from the senses or from another neuron. Remember that in order for messages to be sent across your body, they all travel on nerves. And so let's say as you're seeing this video or listening to the video, your nerves in your ears and your eyes are sending messages all along these neurons, kind of like a little pathway, all the way to your brain. Your brain decides how to interpret them, and then will send messages back out. So you either see something, or if you're trying to move, then your brain will send a message for your skeletal muscles to move a certain way so that you can do what you're thinking about doing. It's quite complicated, and it's actually quite amazing too how quickly your body responds and how quickly these impulses can spread throughout your body. But the dendrites of a neuron will receive the information, and then the axon, the long thing here, is what carries the impulse away from the cell body. So you're talking about in relation to the cell body. When it's coming in from the dendrites, and it all goes out through the axon to keep carrying that impulse along the way. Along the axon, sometimes you'll find this material here. It looks like little capsules. And that's called the myelin sheath. It's kind of like an insulating material that covers it completely around at this area. It's made of fat. So remember when we dissected the bones, if you were here for that, then remember that marrow, it had that waxy kind of, fatty feeling stuff. That's the same thing you would feel with the myelin. It's produced by cells called Schwann cells. And the purpose of that is to speed up the conduction of an impulse. And we're going to look at how that travels here in just a minute. But if you think about an impulse, follow this arrow, my arrow on the screen. If an impulse is coming through here and is trying to go all the way across, well, if it hits this point, it can't go through the myelin. So it actually is going to jump until it hits another blank spot, which would be right here. And then again, it meets another piece of myelin. It can't go through, so it jumps it. It's just going to jump kind of like hopscotch all the way down, and then it can go on straight. So by having these little spots of myelin, it allows the impulse to go faster because it jumps and hops kind of like leapfrog across there. These spots where there is no myelin is called the node of Ranvier. That's named after the scientist who discovered them. And these are gaps in the myelin sheath, and it allows the impulse to travel more quickly through the axon. So these are your basic parts of a neuron. So again, to review, we've got the cell body, which contains the nucleus and all the other organelles, mostly mitochondria. The processes that bring impulses into the axon are called the neuron are called the dendrites, and then the process that carries the impulse away is the axon. The A's go together, axon away. So try to remember it that way. And this myelin sheath is insulating and increases the impulse, and so the impulses can jump through across the nodes of Ranvier. So how does this work? It's extremely complicated, and so the next picture you have will hopefully just pare it down to the minimum of what's going on. So look at your next diagram, and so this is what synaptic transmission is. Move myself down here. What you have here is two neurons that are close together, and we're going to have impulses traveling from one to another neuron. Now, when they come together, there's actually a space right here, and this area is enlarged right here. And this is what we're going to focus on, this space. What's going on here, where you have one axon that's sending an impulse, and it's going to be sending its impulse to the dendrite of another axon. So dendrites bring it toward, axon away. So when it gets to the end of an axon, it's going to be communicating with the dendrite of a second neuron. This space between the two processes is called a synapse. See, here's the word synapse. That's the space between. And so here's the axon of the first one, and the neuron that it's communicating with, that's a dendrite. So we've got this, it is an electrical signal. That's why you can get struck by lightning, because it fries your nerves, basically, is what happens when you get struck by lightning. It sends electricity all through your neurons and damages those. But this electrical signal, it can't move in this space. And so your neurons have to convert the electrical signal into a chemical signal so that it can keep going through the space. It's like me touching, if I have electricity and I want to shock you, what do I have to do first? I have to touch you, or as I'm getting closer, you can kind of feel the electricity, but it doesn't travel until I actually make contact with your skin. So electricity can't jump spaces like that, so it has to convert it to a chemical signal, and that's what this process of synaptic transmission is. It's the conversion of electricity to chemicals. So let's look at these steps here as far as how it keeps going. So the first thing to happen is the electrical signal. That's what an action potential is. An electrical signal will arrive at this portion of the neuron. This portion of the neuron is before the synapse. Remember, the synapse is the space. It's before the synapse. So this word presynaptic, that means pre means before, synaptic is referring to the synapse, the space. So this is happening before the space. So that's how you know it's right here, because it's before the space. So this electrical signal arrives here at the presynaptic terminal. A terminal is the end of something. That's why a terminal disease means it ends your life. So the terminal is the end of the axon. When it gets there, it's going to open these calcium channels. Remember, we talked about how you need calcium for muscle transmission, for muscles to contract. You also need them for your nerves. So that's why calcium is so important to have in your body, enough of that. So calcium channels open up, and when that happens, it allows these vesicles. A vesicle, just think of it like a bag of candy. It kind of looks like a Halloween jack-o'-lantern here. But think of it as a bag of candy. The candy on the inside consists of these chemicals. They're going to travel across the space. Remember, we're converting from an electrical signal to a chemical signal. Here are the chemicals inside the bag. So the calcium being produced will cause these vesicles or bags to open up and release the chemical, which is called a neurotransmitter. We're transmitting or sending the nerve impulse, so that's why it's called a neurotransmitter. So here it shows you the neurotransmitters coming out. You can't really see them. It's kind of dark on my screen, but these are the little triangles right here. So this used to be a bag. So when I say that the synaptic vesicles release the neurotransmitters, they move toward the end and they fuse with this membrane and just dump out the chemicals. That's what step number 3 is talking about. And so these neurotransmitters, the chemicals, are released into the space, the synapse, and they're going to travel across the space. And they're going to go to receptors that are on the postsynaptic neuron. So if pre means before the space, synaptic, then post, what does that mean? Yes, post means after. So after the space, the synaptic refers to the synapse. So after the space, the neuron that's after that is what we're talking about. Well, this would be it right here. It's the dendrite. It has these receptors, which are these little white shapes. And these neurotransmitters are going to move across and bind to the receptors. You notice they fit perfectly. These are triangles, and they're going to fit directly in these shapes. Neurotransmitters and receptors are kind of like a lock and key. You have one key that opens the door of your car, that runs your car. You have one key that opens a different key that opens up your house. You don't have one key that opens everything. They're very specific to the lock. So think of the neurotransmitters as being like the key and the receptors being like the lock. They have to fit perfectly in there for them to do their job. And depending on, you have a lot of different kinds of neurotransmitters, chemicals floating around. So depending on what cell it's trying to get to and what receptor is present, it may or may not work. But we're saying here it is going to work. These are going to fit into this key or the lock, the receptor. And then you have, once the receptor binds to it and it fits in there, then the sodium channels are going to open up here on the postsynaptic neuron and allow the electricity to keep going. So, and that's what this means. Impulse continues. So you've got electricity. Oh, chemical. It binds to it, then electrical again. So it's electrical, chemical. This whole process of when you just think of something and your body does what you tell it to do, all of this is happening in nanoseconds, so you can do it quickly enough. So that's basically how it happens. The next diagram you have will show you, oops, let me go back here. This is looking at some very specific details with sodium. I mentioned that last thing in there is that sodium channels open. So what exactly is going on with sodium? And the other chemical I didn't mention before is potassium. So we looked at the chemical part before. This is the electrical part. So what happens, here's the axon. We have the electricity going. It involves the sodium and potassium ions. So this is an axon, All right, so I have this picture, this model. All right, so here's the model of a neuron. Try to get this in the right view so you can see it. So here's the cell body right here is the big part. Here's the nucleus. This would be the axon. And all this is up here is just an enlarged view of the axon. And this is that myelin I was telling you about that covers and insulates it, where the impulse can jump to the next spot. So we're looking at this right here is what you see here. Okay, so that's the axon that we're looking at. When normally you have sodium, a lot of sodium on the outside of the axon, the outside of the membrane, and the potassium is real high on the inside of the membrane. So what happens when an impulse arrives? Okay, it has to get to a certain point. That's what the threshold is. But once you meet the minimum, the threshold, then the impulse can travel on down the membrane. So at this point, drag this one box over to the right spot on your picture. The impulse arrives and the threshold is met. Notice the impulse is traveling this way. Once that happens, then these channels can open up. These are sodium channels. These are potassium channels, kind of like gates. If you open up the gate, that's what they're talking about here. And so these voltage-gated sodium channels open up, and it allows sodium to come into the cell. In order for an impulse to travel, you have to get sodium in and potassium out. If it's not traveling, then sodium stays on the outside, potassium stays on the inside. But you have to swap places in order for this nerve impulse to travel. So once it comes here, the gate opens, sodium goes in, and you see potassium going out here. So drag your little potassium and sodium figures to the right spot. You're going to drag this one over here. Voltage-gated potassium channels are open. Potassium leaves the cell. Once potassium leaves, then sodium is going to kind of chill out for a little bit. As the impulse travels down the neuron, these potassium channels are staying open, so even more potassium leaves the cell. And these sodium channels are considered to be in the resting state. And then finally, the sodium, there's a pump on the inside of the neuron. It's going to pump the sodium and potassium back to the original levels. It's going to kick sodium out to go back outside and bring potassium back in. And the impulse can then start over again. We don't just send an impulse one time and we're done. The neurons work constantly and they have to replenish. The sodium has to be high on the outside. Potassium needs to be high on the inside in order for this whole thing to start over again. So it's almost like if you take a bunch of water and dump it in your tub and you're like, oh, I need to get it out of the tub to do it again. You have to dump it back out so it goes back in, okay? Now, this diagram here, if it doesn't look already familiar to you, it will next year when you take advanced CNA and you're learning about the electrical impulses of the heart. It's the same thing. This is what's called an action potential. And each part of this shape corresponds to what's going on up here. So you are supposed to type in words. They give you the words on the side there, but this is what you're going to type in these different spots. So at the first point, this is this part right here where the impulse arrives. It hasn't really sent off the electricity yet. So that first blank will be the threshold. That's what that's talking about here with threshold. So it's coming. We've met the threshold, so now we can send electricity. And so number 2 is called depolarization. Depolarization is when the sodium goes in and potassium comes out. At this point where it says sodium channels begin to rest, that's at this peak right here. So once the sodium channels start resting and they completely get to the resting state, that's what number 3 is, and that's called repolarization. repolarization. Number 4 is this refractory period when we're waiting before the pump kicks in. And then when that happens, the neuron is considered to be at the resting state because the pump has restored the original levels of sodium and potassium. So as I mentioned, it's pretty complicated, and this is as simple as I could make it. You won't have to do too many things with this, but I did want to talk to you a little bit about that because you are going to see some stuff with that later. Okay, so once again, this is an action potential, and we're talking about the neuron and how it spreads the electrical impulse down the axon, and then when it gets to the end, it's going to convert that to a chemical impulse, a chemical thing where the neurotransmitter moves across that space. When it hits the next dendrite of the next neuron, that postsynaptic neuron, then it will start back electrical again all over with this. So that is how neurons work, and we will look at some other information in the next video.